Welcome everyone. Here we are with another immersive research chat. Today I've got a friend and colleague, Dr. Emma Poulton from Durham University. Emma, just want to say hi.
Good morning. Hiya.
So I've known Emma, and I'm going to slightly embarrass her here straight away. I've known Emma through her name being on a thesis that was in my supervisor's office when I started. And we met at a policy event, didn't we? Is that where we first met? In London?
Yeah. It was really.
Event.
I do remember. Oh, my memory's not good for things like that, but I remember the first time meeting you, and it was really cool just because of the connection we had in terms of our mutual PhD supervisor.
Yeah. So we met there, and then we've spoken a few times about different stuff. But yes, for me, you've been in a long list of people who had successfully done a PhD ahead of me, who Joe used to refer to at various different times. So what we're going to talk about today is Emma's work in football. And just one quick note, anyone who's followed me on Twitter knows that I can't abide football. But we've had 3 of these talks now where we've really got into immersive research, and they've all been with people who've done research on football. So note to myself to do better on that as well. So can you just get us started then? Tell us a bit about what you do at work and how you got into academia and then, I guess, studying sport as well.
Yeah, it's been a long journey, I guess, now. If I look back, I've been working in the field of sociology of sport for 25 years, longer. My undergraduate degree was in politics, absolutely nothing to do with sport, but I played a lot of sport while studying politics. Have to be honest, didn't really know what I was going to do at the end of that undergraduate degree at Nottingham. And back in the day, you read, the newspapers to sort of see adverts. So I think it was in the Guardian education supplement, something like that. I saw an advert for a master's degree in European leisure studies at Loughborough.
Right.
Really fancied the sound of that, particularly the European element, which gave me a little jaunt around Europe, with terms in Belgium, Holland, and Spain before returning to Loughborough. And it was during the Loughborough leg of that where I started to see the connections between sport and politics, sport's place in society, and the problematic nature of it. Had some lectures from Joe Maguire, and to cut a long story short, I applied for a PhD position with him, and that was where I really got into sociology of sport big time, and started my PhD work on media representations of national identity, and the patriotism that can spawn via the xenophobia in the context of the 1996 European Football Championships. So that's where it all began, and my research on the back of that was always about sort of media representations of football fan culture, really. That led on to more work in the area of football fan culture, particularly the representations of so-called football hooligans. And then in the last, getting on for 10 years now, my interest has continued in terms of football fan culture, and I've moved on to look at forms of discrimination in football, but particularly a heavy focus on antisemitism in football.
Yeah.
Which we'll probably talk about as well.
Yeah, and in terms of what you do up at Durham, what sort of stuff do you teach up there?
So I'm one of the sociologists of sport on our degree programs, undergraduate programs, and I lead modules in sport, crime and deviance, media, sport and society, sport, culture and society. So it's just a pathway that we have running through our undergraduate programs on sociology of sport.
Okay, cool. So let's kind of delve into some of the research then, and kind of set up the point with a kind of sexist comment about football being for men, the male preserve, and traditionally even the research was dominated by men. Still, even the game now is dominated by in symbolic ways, and also in frequency of how many professional players are there men, all that sort of stuff. So how do we kind of get into women researching that area, and especially the kind of the most laddie masculine part of that, the hooligan side of it? How did that come about? How did you get into that as a start point?
Well, that was something that I have to, confess, I never thought I would be able to do. I never thought I could gain that access to that, hyper masculinized subculture. All the research about football hooligan culture, was being done by men. There were big sort of gladiatorial academic debates, quite acrimonious at times, between the Leicester School, Gary Armstrong, Richard Giulianotti, and so forth. And here I was, somebody who, a young at the time female researcher, a young female academic who was conducting research on media representations of football hooligans, whether it be newspaper coverage of, something kicking off, a World Cup or a European Championship, or hooligan films as a genre. But I felt a bit of a fraud because, there I was sort of analysing these representations, but I can't say that I, had necessarily met a hooligan, or, had that sort of, been privy to the actual subculture that I was writing about. So I never thought, as much as I wanted to, I never thought that I'd be able to get that access. I felt sort of slightly sort of shut out in the academic circles that were researching the phenomena. And, I just thought it was a domain that, as a young woman, and a young female academic as well, because let's face it, hooligan subcultures notoriously, sort of academic interest. To actually think it's a bit of a laugh that people want to sit in their ivory towers and spout about them. There's always been that sort of piss take, but also sort of cynicism, and suspicion of anyone wanting to research them, because of undercover journalists, or because of some ethnographic research that had been done. So yeah, I just never thought I'd get that opportunity, and then I got a stroke of luck.
Oh, good.
And that was, I was contacted by somebody who at first I thought it was a wind up. I thought someone was having me on, but it was someone claiming to be a promoter for a sort of a series of not after dinner talks, but sort of doing a sort of a pub circuit, a working men's club circuit of ex-hooligans, or hooligans that had been in the Football Factory's Danny Dyer TV series.
Yeah.
And they contacted me, inviting me to one of these nights. And I just, as I say, I just thought, why? This is weird. I'll tell you another thing. The guy's name was Alcock. And that, to me, again, just gave me alarm bells. I just thought, given the innuendo, someone is just having me on. But it worked out. I sort of left it, I don't know, a week or so, so as not to look too super keen. Wrote back with sort of, mooted interest. What have you got in mind? And I did get invited along, and that was my break, if you like, to tip my toe into that subculture that I never thought I'd get a chance to actually step into.
Yeah, gatekeepers come in many forms, eh? I've never done work on hooliganism, but I've been called a hooligan, just in the state of the way that I kind of present myself in some ways. And we just used to go and watch Forest, and I know from personal experience I could very easily have physically got involved in hooliganism. I was welcomed into that space just by going in with no interest. It's different, so interesting, the different ways in which the doors get open for you as men researching men's spaces, and that brings with it a lot of opportunities to bring ideas back from the field and all that sort of stuff. But it's just one voice speaking to another similar voice, isn't it? And I think I'm hoping you'll be able to kind of tell us about some of the benefits of being different, of clearly kind of not being one of them. Although I'm sure you could be a hooligan if you really wanted to. But my point is that the assumption is that similarity would be the better tool for doing that research. You're close to them, you're like them, you can know their experiences, me in boxing. But actually, difference is a great tool in some ways. And maybe you disagree, but have you got any thoughts on almost the strength that brought to the research?
Yeah, I'll come back to that in a minute, but you're spot on there in terms of, we've all got our own, every individual has got their own sort of identity and status markers, in terms of their age, their educational background, their class, their accent associated with that class, or where they're from, their race, their ethnicity, their sexuality. And all of mine seem to be against me, none least because of my gender. I've got I don't know, a home counties kind of southern accent. As I say, I was this female academic, and the academic connotation for hooligans, isn't good. So I thought all that was going to work against me. It didn't in the end. It wasn't as problematic as I thought once I got that opportunity, once I got that in. But at the same time, I was always so conscious of my sort of identity, my image management, and my presentation of self, in a way that a guy of your size, stature, look wouldn't be. For me, I was constantly wrestling with what to wear. If it had been you could have just slapped on a designer label of hooligan choice, and immediately you'd have sort of looked it. I mean, if you've ever seen, if you've ever met Gary Armstrong, similarly, he is a big guy. He, short cropped hair. He sort of looks the part.
Yeah.
Rich Giulianotti doesn't actually. He's a very sort of small, diminutive looking guy. But I don't know. For me, it was, I was wrestling with, how do I dress? Do I go down the sort of emphasize femininity route? That doesn't come naturally to me at the best of times, and then it would, I was thinking, well, the flip side of that, of course, is, you could look sort of too, flirtatious or whatever. Do I go down a sort of power dressing route? It, again, doesn't sit comfortably with me, and how would that look? I'm an absolute short ass. I'm 5'3.5", so my whole sort of size and stature, didn't sit comfortably for me. I had to think it through in terms of how I wanted to present myself to these guys that I ended up meeting, and having lots of really useful, meaningful interviews, conversations, where I felt that actually at times they were really quite candid with me in a way that perhaps they wouldn't have been with another man.
Yeah, and I think that's where we kind of get to. You spent a lot of time thinking about it, but I wonder if you just step in there, and as an outsider, they go, all right, well, you don't know anything about this. I've got nothing to fear from you. And, it sounds kind of, again, it's a sexist, it's literally them being sexist. You're 5'2", you're a woman. I'm not bothered about you. I'm going to tell you anything, because what can you do to hurt me? And I wonder if that sort of power dynamic is something. I know PhD student who's currently working with me, similar size to you, who's gone and spoke to a very important person within medical regulation of sport. And she's very, very competent, and he was treating her like she was a child. And when she got over that, she was like, okay, speak to me like I'm a child. And all the stuff that came out because of that, because he just didn't see her as a threat. I'm wary of using kind of sexist language, but I know that these spaces are sexist. So I wonder if that is something that you kind of dealt with or thought about at all.
That was certainly a concern that they or an assumption that I made, that it was a sexist, misogynist subculture. It might have been an age dynamic as well, because I was mixing with retired hooligans, which placed them 10-15 years older than me. So they actually seemed like they were looking after me.
Right.
They seemed quite respectful in that sense. They when they sort of introduced me to other sort of ex-firm members, it was, or they would refer to me as the doc.
Right.
So it was very much this, oh, you're that university woman, you're the researcher, so I was placed as an outsider in that sense, but I felt I was embraced. They were looking out for me. I actually said, before I went into a setting where I'd meet a lot of the lads, how do they know I'm coming? What will they feel? How will they be? And my main contact said, you're here as my guest. The lads know that, they'll respect that. End of.
Yeah.
So it was more perhaps my hang-ups about what to expect, and, as I say, how to dress, how to act, how to interact. I'm so familiar with football fan culture that I'm comfortable in that environment. Once if I get talking about football, I'm on. It's like a question of sport. I'm playing home. So you could almost see sort of, if I was saying, oh yeah, when you played so and so, you could see a sort of a penny drop that I knew my stuff.
Yeah.
And that helped, so obviously going into, a tricky environment, clued up, so you're not going to be shown up as naive, was important, I felt, at least.
Yeah, and it sounds like one of the assumptions around hooligans is that they're literally hooligans, no control, no code of ethics, just all over the place. But from research, we know that they do have a code of ethics, and that might be
very
around
much so. Yeah.
What tools are being brought to the fight, but also this I'm vouching for this person, that's that, and that code is something that it sounds like you've been able to kind of to explore and to also use as part of the methodology, almost to like, well, I'm accepted now, that's it, someone's vouched for me.
Yeah, well, that I'll give you two stories on that illustrative of it. One was a positive, and one was a negative, I guess. After I had sort of 2 or 3 meetings, this was when I went into the setting where I met a lot of them, and all sort of ex-firm members. And one of them said something that still bemuses, perplexes me, humours me to this day, because this lad said, oh yeah, we've heard that if you had balls, you'd be one of us. And as a sociologist, that has so many meanings and connotations, in terms of sort of my gender, his gender, this notion of, having some kind of cojones and the thought that I must have said enough in conversations to give them the idea that I had the propensity to be a hooligan myself. So I don't know, it's sort of, it struck me as odd, but something of a badge of honour in a strange kind of way.
Yeah.
The negative, when you go back to this notion of a code, I really inadvertently messed up. We'd got an arrangement whereby one of these guys was going to come to Durham to give a talk to the students, and he pulled out, withdrew at quite last minute, only with a couple of days to go. And in my email, I said, really disappointed. The students would be disappointed. I thought we had a gentleman's agreement about this. Oh my God, that was red rag to a bull. Everything went Pete Tong after that. The suggestion, well, just my use of the term gentleman's agreement, just seemed to, just, I don't know, just it was like just hit his sense of masculinity. I don't know, but it was just the wrong phrase, throwaway phrase that I used. And he went ballistic. I feared that I'd just blown everything. He ranted on about. He sort of ridiculed me, really. He said that he sort of we've had a laugh. We've had such fun watching you, watching us.
Right.
So all the sort of what I thought the good work, the rapport that I'd established, seemed to have, just go up in smoke because of my use of this term. So that was in sort of a text message exchange, and I just thought, oh God, what am I going to do here? This is really gone tits up. So I just decided, right, I'm going to ring him, just have it out with him, apologise, explain what I meant, just apologise for hurting his sense of this whole arrangement thing, or this gentleman's agreement. So it just brought home to me, that what I've referred to as doing gendered research in a hypermasculine field. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that as a guy, and what gentleman's agreement means to you, but that was just an absolute no to have used as a term.
Yeah, I think there's two points that come to me. One is Lawrence de Garris's critique of Wacant's work on boxing, where Wacant describes getting a bloody nose and a few other kind of, taking his hits and all that sort of stuff. And de Garris rightly says, what does that have to do with anything? You got a bloody nose. Does that mean your research is more valid or whatever? And just the kind of the critique of a researcher's, and I'm not putting this onto you, but the assumption that, I was in, they loved me, I was fine. And Wacant he doesn't use that language, but his book Body and Soul is written with that in mind, that he was just completely accepted, and that's very problematic. And Lawrence de Garris makes that critique. And so I wonder if that's that kind of idea of like, oh no, I'm in the pub with these guys, they like me, and all that sort of stuff, which we can all kind of fall foul to. And I think the more we think about it, the more we recognise that we are still researchers. We are, in their eyes, nerds or dweebs or don't know anything. And the one that I got a lot was, oh right, so you're a journalist. And the amount of times I'd say I wasn't a journalist, but they just didn't. Also didn't care as well. Just whatever. But then the other thought was, and reading this in a very, very kind of gendered boy way, that he was going into your space for the first time at university. And I can very much imagine people that I've interviewed coming into my space. They previously dominated the space where I went into, on their terms. Now he's coming into yours. And I can completely understand why someone might even make an excuse up as to why they might not do that. And then quickly power grab as soon as they're given any chance. Gentlemen, you're not a gentleman, da, 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 da. And it'd be a big power grab. And I can see how that would work from a kind of a male perspective. So I don't know. I mean, I'm just kind of throwing some potential ideas out there, but it certainly is interesting, isn't it? Those moments that force us to reflect. And we know we've got to reflect on our position in research, and we know we've got to do a better job of that. But those things happen, and it's, as you said, like, oh shit, oh gosh.
Yeah. It was difficult because we'd had sort of half a dozen meetings, conversations by that point, and I'd sort of grown to sort of like the guys, But I'm not naive to think that I was ever properly in. I always think that I dipped my toe and had as closer interaction as possible for a female academic. That is the bottom line. But those two identity markers, always made it a challenging, problematic situation for me. I'm not saying that someone like yourself could have got any more immersed, because I think that academic tag was always going to be there. And plus you mentioned journalists. Journalists, as I've already mentioned, a sniff of some kind of investigative undercover journalism, and you are you're in a hiding to nothing. So there were always going to be those suspicions from them. We managed to smooth things over a little bit and what have you, and I suppose I got what I needed in terms of the interviews that I conducted. But that did cut me to the quick then. Put my foot in it by a throwaway line, but such a loaded line in terms of gendered language.
One that I did and had to stop doing, being a young novice researcher doing a project which is based on gender studies in effect, I asked the boxers when I was doing their formal interviews, what's your sexuality? And I laugh at it now, even asking the question, because I've never asked that question in life, let alone to a boxer that I've been boxing with for a year. And it seems in a landscape where sexuality is not discussed at all, except for in one way, and that's in a homophobic way, possibly. And I remember doing it, and I remember because I was a novice researcher, I didn't know any better, and I was like, well, I've got to find out what sexuality they are. And I remember doing it a couple of times, and eventually it was getting to the point where I was going to get beat up. I was going to have to stop doing my whole research because I was asking these questions that I thought I needed to ask as a researcher. And again, just a moment of like daftness, which just made me kind of like, it just made me so clear to them that I wasn't in their group because I was a researcher, even though that question to me was the stupidest question in the world. I didn't want to ask it. I felt uncomfortable asking it, but I did it anyway. But those moments are really useful. It's a good teachable moment for me now, still. And to basically infer their sexuality, which is a fundamental problem, isn't it? If you think about inference in terms of research. So just to start kind of pulling things together a little bit, you talked about that you've done some research on racism, and I wondered, collecting data on racism. How do you go about doing that? What do you do when if someone says they're racist or says racist things in front of you? It's something that I've had to deal with. I wonder if you dealt with it in a different way to me.
My research has been on a particular form of racism, although that's a debated point as well, but specifically on anti-Semitism. Okay, so I've spoken more to victims of anti-Semitism,
right,
rather than perpetrators of it. But I mean that in terms of doing research has brought up some interesting experiences as well, because again, it's sort of entering a different subculture. We go back to my identity markers. I'm not Jewish, and I'm female. As a female, I'm not supposed to shake the hand of a Jewish man, but certainly before COVID, that's the first thing I would do when I met someone going into an interview situation. So I naively very quickly learned after the first couple of interviews, I was being left, and people were very good about it. And then I had an interview with a rabbi, and I was sort of suddenly found myself thinking, God, how do I address this person? If you, I don't know, if you meet a priest, you're supposed to call them father or vicar or whatever. But I was sort of found, Googling and texting Jewish friends saying, how do I address this person? But yeah, I suppose I've moved off your question, but I haven't had those conversations with anti-Semitic or racist people, apart from a few unfortunate interactions on Twitter.
Right. Okay. So in terms of for people who want to do research like this, the landscape has certainly changed in some respects, in that I think from how you described this, the world has shifted in terms of access for women into sport. But just in a general sense, how does someone go and get into, if you were to give some tips, I know you've given examples already, but for somebody who wants to go and get into a social space that they're not yet comfortable in or accepted in, how would you recommend a few points to consider as they go into trying to do stuff like that?
I would encourage people to do it. I for a long time thought it was impossible. And as I say, yes, in the end, I got a bit of a stroke of luck. But I think, that we're talking that 10, 15 years ago. Today, I think it would be there's more opportunities to approach people, and then try and negotiate actually gaining access. But even 10 years ago, you didn't quite have the social media access that we do now, where you can, interact with people, on social media first, and that might provide at least an opportunity to say, can I come and interview you type thing. So I think that access is easier than it was, and for that reason, would encourage people not to sit like I did for years thinking it was just a no-no. Notwithstanding that, once you have the opportunity and you are entering, difficult, challenging spaces, because of perhaps that conflict of identity status markers, I do think it's really important. It sounds pretty basic, but you need a sort of a personal safety strategy. As simple as basic as meet in busy places. Make sure that people know where you're going, who you're meeting, when to expect you back. Make sure that you've got transport links that aren't going to leave you stranded or whatever. I mean, that sounds very sort of basic, or perhaps even sort of mollycoddling, but it's so important. And be prepared to deal with the emotional labor of it all. I've said how I thought through what I was wearing, my whole sort of image management, and I might have been overthinking it, but I think you've got to be prepared for and know that it's okay to struggle a bit and labor a bit over these things. When we do research, it's not all research methods textbook. So to share, to have a conversation like this and talk about the warts and all nature of it, and how you do find yourself in tricky situations, uncomfortable situations, thinking, oh, shit, I've really upset this guy, now I'm going to have to really kiss his ass to get him back on side. Okay, you're not, like I say, you're not going to read that in a research methods textbook, but it is the reality sometimes. When you're in, awkward, negotiating a space that you're not too welcome in, let's say.
Yeah. And one of the things that I encourage of my students that do research like this is, especially PhD students in our department, sports science department, so there's very much a lot of lab-based work, and I try and get students doing kind of immersive ethnographic work to think of themselves as going into the lab. And a lab isn't always fun. In fact, a lab is often really boring, and you have to do stuff that's stressful and difficult. Well, that's the same as doing this sort of research. We're so lucky that we can go and watch football games or go and box and do that as part of it. But that's the little benefit on the side. Actually, we've got to interact with a load of people that we probably don't like. And interacting with people we don't like is not something that most people are good at. Because what do we do in normal life? We just get out of that space, unless it's family Christmas, we have to stay in it. But largely, I think we get used to just going, oh God, this person is saying something horrific, I don't want to be there. And your job as that researcher is to stay there and to knuckle down and go, oh God, this is what I'm here for. And then the other thing, I think, I just want to pick out what you said, just the doing. I've always been very, very gung-ho with almost everything I've done, and that always leads to problems, but it has brought me a lot of success along the way. And I think as long as you've got that safety protocol in place, just going and being in these spaces is the step. It's the same as writing your first essay. You've got to write the first words. Writing your first paper, you've got to write the first words. Doing your first research in this is going and taking the step in. And I think that advice that you had for people of just, don't think you can't, think you do. And then once you kind of figure out from being in it that you can't do it, well, fair enough. And just one example from my life that I'm still trying to figure out is I really want to do research on animal fighting, on dog fighting. So I'm a dog lover, and I really want to bring some information out from that. And I remember Mike Atkinson talking about this to me, and he was saying he'd done some work on it and he had to pull himself out of that space. And I think I can be in that space, and I think I can stay in that space. I just can't find it. So even in like someone who's experienced in these sort of cultures and those spaces with men who are like that, I still can't get access. There's limits to it as well.
Oh, I couldn't do that. God.
No, I know it's hard, but I think I can switch off a little bit in certain ways to the emotional side of it. But we'll see. I mean, maybe I'm over-egging it. So one thing that I just want to kind of move on to, the last area really, is just where do we send young scholars and maybe advanced scholars who want to shift into this sort of stuff. The first thing I'd say is that some of the stuff that you've talked about is really well dealt with by Bloom's text, Symbolic Interaction. In his methods section, it's fantastic. It's very much dated, and it talks about you have to be immersed, you have to know this sort of stuff. And I think that's a little bit too far. But where you made me think of this was that you were doing your media research and you felt disconnected from the space. And then you went and got into it. And there is something in that. There is something in going and understanding it from that close-in space. I think Bloom's text, and I'll put a link to that. But I mean, what were the texts that helped you? And then also, can you highlight where you've written about this as well?
Yeah, there's a couple of papers that I've written on this where I've taken that quote that I gave you about having the balls, so that people could read that if they felt like it. I particularly like the work of, her work, Kath Woodward. Just because it's a female researcher going into a masculine subculture of men's boxing. I also like the work of Karen Lumsden, who worked with boy racers.
Wow.
So just to read, about other female researchers' encounters, in the a masculine or hypermasculine subculture. Amanda Kofi's work on emotional labour is reassuring, and I can't sort of yeah, you know, I don't want to downplay that aspect of it, you know, because of that having to think things through. And, you know, I don't know, you know, in your research, you know, if you've sort of felt crestfallen, or, you know, or you know, had to sort of, or, you know, or yeah, just felt, oh, you know, that's not right, or, you know, how can I fit in a bit better? It's yeah, and just feeling down about it, feeling it being challenging. I've spoken obviously about presentation of self, so Goffman, the go-to there. In terms of men who have, you know, perhaps immersed themselves more in hooligans subculture, would be Jeff Pearson's work. More recently, you know, than the likes of Armstrong and Giulianotti.
Yeah, cool. And Jeff's actually done a video with me, so I'll link into that as well. I think this will
Oh,
work.
there you go then. Yeah.
It'll really work well as a combination. And Kath has been very, very significant in my work. Kath Woodward's work, which I'll link to, Hanging About and Hanging Around, or something like that. And then because I always contrast mine, you know, young at the time man versus older at the time woman. But there's a contrast between the positions that you've taken and Kath took. Kath was the mother, and she used that role. I mean, I used it sounds bad, but performed that role as she does, and the lad spoke to her in the gym because of it. So it's another way of getting access. None of them fundamentally better than the other. All have strengths and weaknesses and all the rest of it. Okay, great. So that's really useful. I'll put links to a few of them at least in there, and hopefully people have found that useful. Anything else to say before we call it a day?
That's it. Job's a good one.
Cool, brilliant. Yeah, that was really good. I think people will find that really useful. Okay, thanks again, Emma.